Good morning slash good afternoon, Mr. Reed, coming at you live. Um, so today we're going to be talking about culture. I believe this is our fourth concept for this course. How did we get here? My goodness, it's going by quickly. Um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about culture and what that entails. So the concept of culture is central to the study of language and literature. It raises the question of how a text relates to the respective values, beliefs, and attitudes prevalent in them and their significance. So before I even get into today's classwork or I talk about some examples, we've been talking a little bit about how an author represents a pair of characters with an intent, right? And so we should always be keeping in mind that even though we're looking for culture, right? We're also looking at some other thematic, conceptual, so like representation, for example, that are prevalent in examples that might have to do with culture. We also know that based on some conversations we've had with classmates that identity is something that is constructed not by the self but rather by society, right? So when a character acts in a particular way, yes, we could say that that's an example of characterization or maybe character development, but it's also very much reflective of the society that they come from, right? And some of the values of those societies or some of the beliefs of those societies or some of the attitudes of those societies. So in a lot of ways, culture is something that is constructed not by people per se, but by society as a whole. Sorry, and when I say people, I mean individual people, right? It's constructed by society as a whole. If you have questions about that, feel free to email me. I know that's kind of a big leap, especially for the first slide, but just kind of keep that in mind while we're reading through this. So today's work, I'd like you should have finished up Mr. Prezada Came to Dine last class, and I'd like you to spend at least 25 minutes today reading our next text, which is Interpretive Maladies, which starts on page 50 on the PDF. And I'd like you to do a clean read first. Just read to enjoy. First 25 minutes. Don't worry about looking for culture. Just kind of read it, take it in, figure out what the plot is, the character, all that stuff. Okay. Once you've spent 25 minutes reading, then I'd like you to go back and spend about 10 to 15 minutes looking through for cultural elements like views, beliefs, and attitudes. Right. Find two examples of culture and present them with the text. Think about how this reveals something about characterization or maybe something about society that they come from. And in addition to that, start thinking about how you're making, again, as I mentioned earlier, making connections to things like representation or identity or maybe it's perspective. Okay. As always, pull directly from the text when you're doing your attendance work and make sure that you provide a page number. So let's start. Let's take a quick look. So this is a really important passage, and I'm going to come back to this because you haven't read this text per se yet. Um, and there's a lot to unpack here, but just to start with some basicalities, right? This is a story that takes place in India. There's lots of allusions to Hinduism, and there are cultural components. So he's talking about here this family, the Das's. And Mr. Kapasi, they visit a temple. It's with wheels on it, and there's a lot of heavy symbolism involved. But this really talks a lot about references to Hinduism and some of the cultural aspects that are associated with that. So already we're seeing the views and ideas culturally being represented in the text. Obviously, again, because I said that there's a lot of symbolism associated with the temple and the story, which you'll learn more about as you read it, that's intended by Lahiri here, right? So there's both representation, but looking at it purely from a cultural point of view, yeah, there's lots of cultural elements presented in this particular passage, dealing with Lahiri's own culture and her own, at least her native religion. Okay, the next section here, I'm going to go ahead and let you read, so just take a minute to hit pause. Okay. So we have two paragraphs from the same page. To dynamically charged passages here at the very beginning of this text, again, just because we haven't started reading this today. So we have one paragraph talking a lot about the clothing, right? And already we are seeing some contrast in the sense of identity of Mr. Capazzi versus the family of the Das. And then in the second one, we have a little bit a sense of cultural differences in mannerisms and greetings as well. So there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, so let's start looking at cultural aspects of this. So, despite the Das's looking Indian from the point of view of Mr. Kapasi, it becomes obvious early on that the family and their guide, despite sharing similar places of origin, right, share very different values, beliefs, and attitudes. And these values, beliefs, and attitudes are shaped by the societies both of Mr. Das and of the Das's and Mr. Kapasi, right? So we know that the Das's are on a trip. They're from the United States, right? Mr. Kapasi is a native of India. But here he intends to show the stark contrast of cultural values early on in the story through the differences in appearances and mannerisms, greetings. For example, the Dasas come from a colonizing country. When Mr. Kapasi associates with economic wealth, materialism, emotional and spiritual prosperity. And then later in the story, we're going to see some of the irony in this. Dun, 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 not giving too much away. The Das, meanwhile, are getting in touch with their roots and visiting the old country, which we know, historically speaking, was affected by partition and colonial influences and religious separatism. Right, so we have obviously kind of tying back to some similar themes from when Mr. Perzada came to dine. We're still kind of keeping with this colonial perspective. But we're also looking at it through the ways in which characters interact with one another based on their cultural differences. Okay, and speak of here we go, post-colonialist lens, right? When we're assessing cultural practices, the Das's lukewarm reception to Mr. Kapasi is reflective of a colonial mentality and establishes an earlier dynamic, right? Obviously, they don't have the same history per se because one lives in another country, so their mannerisms and attitudes have been shaped by the society that they come from. And because of that, there really is a clear difference in how they approach people and a sense of respect and cultural attitudes in general. Okay, this next slide, I kind of wanted to, as I've been working through these concepts, I've been thinking about how to share some of the larger ideas that are going to be presented next year in IB, right? And so the idea of producing a slide like this is basically to just say, hey, here's some things that you're probably going to be talking about and making arguments about for next year in IB 11, okay? And even if you're not going to IB next year, you're also probably going to be dealing with similar issues. But the idea of this slide is not to overwhelm you by any means, right? It's just supposed to say, hey, here's something that if you're a high-reaching student, check this out. Read through this, see what this is all about. If you have questions, let's talk about it because it's really fascinating stuff. But basically, I'm taking the same example that I did here, and I'm really magnituding it into not magnitude. I'm blowing this into a lot more larger argumentation that you would see in IB, right? Magnifying, that's the word I'm looking for, magnifying. All right. So I'm not going to read this, and I'm not going to overtly explain this, but take a minute to read through it because you'll be dealing with this later. And if it's a lot, don't worry, because I'm not going to be assessing you on this, right? Just kind of keep in mind some of the concepts we've been dealing with. All right, last slide on the doc today. So in addition to your two examples of culture that you're going to be looking for and examples from the text, I'd like you to go ahead and choose one option. Just check out. We have a really cool one from that movie that I'm drawing a blank on. What's the name of that? Crazy Rich Asians. We also have Avatar, and then we also have Black Panther, right? So go ahead and check out one of these, watch the video, answer the questions. Attendance will be posted right here, and have a wonderful day.